In with the saying Shavua Tov to Shabbat. Please join me in the Havdalah ceremony. I'm going to ask you to rise. ושאפתם מים בששון ממעייני הישועה לאדוני הישועה על עמך בכסף הסלע אדוני צבאות עמנו משגב לנו אלוהי יעקב סלע אדוני צבאות אשרייתו מבוטי יעקב Adonai Yoshia, Amelech Yaneinu, Yom Koreinu, La Yehudim Haita, Ora Simcha V'Sasambika Kenti Elanu, Kos Yeshua Sesa, V'B'Shem Adonai Yikra. La 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 Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei peri hagafen borei peri hagafen la 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 Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei minei v'samim borei minei v'samim la 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 Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei me'orei ha'esh borei me'orei ha'esh la 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 Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamavdil bein ha'nefesh ben Yisrael ha'amim bein yom hashvi'i l'sheishes yemei ha'maseh Baruch atah Adonai hamavdil bein kodesh lechol hamavdil bein kodesh lechol la 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 Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hatishbi, Eliyahu, Eliyahu, Eliyahu Giladi. Shavua Tov to everybody. Have a wonderful week. Looking forward now to our program as I hand you over to Bram Canzer and Dr. Charles Small.
Thank you, Rabbi. It's my honor to introduce everyone to Charles Asher Small, who is the founding director and president of the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. In a moment, I'm going to turn the conversation over to Charles to answer some of the questions that I brought with me today, this evening, on a very serious matter, but the focus of it is one of prescription, which in a very simple explanation is what can we do about it? What's the answer? So our title, Is There a Prescription for Anti-Semitism Today, reflects on the idea that we're not dealing with the anti-Semitism of our fathers or grandfathers and years ago, and yet it's related. It's somewhat the same, somewhat different. And I wrote a very short introduction, which I'll read out. Anti-Semitism has grown within organizations generally thought to be sympathetic to Jews, or at the very least indifferent. Academic institutions of higher learning, mainstream media, political parties, and socially active groups such as Black Lives Matter, and industrial unions are now part of our social environment, where even entertainers and sports personalities feel little hesitation to express what many would consider anti-Semitic statements. So I asked the question, how did this happen? Did we miss the warning signs? How bad is it? And more importantly, what are the prescriptions for curing the growth of this force? So I'll begin by introducing and asking Charles to tell us a little bit about how he came to be in this situation as head of this organization, the general focus of what the research is that he's dealing with, and to then answer that question, how bad is it? Good evening, Charles.
Good evening. So I'm honored to be here. I'd like to thank you for engaging with me, for inviting me. I also want to thank Rabbi Bright very much. It's really an honor to be at the shul of my family, my parents, Norman and Judy Small, have been longtime members, and they've always found a home at the shul with Rabbi Bright. So it's very important, and it's a great honor to be with you this evening. So I'll just answer the question briefly. So I'm originally from Montreal, and growing up in Montreal, I was very, I think, engaged in the Jewish community. It's a special community with leading rabbis. I studied for many years with Rabbi Daniel Mund. We had, teachers and writers and poets and novelists, Mordechai Richler, Leonard Cohen, Erwin Kotler, Ruth Weiss. There were so many, I think, giants around to nurture a curious kid. So I kind of come from, I think I'm a product of a very special family and community. And as a kid, I was always interested in the place of the Jewish community in Quebec, kind of stuck between the Anglos and the Francophones, sort of the Quebec nationalists and the Anglo-Saxon Protestants. We were sort of stuck in the middle. If in a sense, we were the quintessential other, les autres. And I studied the subject of multiculturalism and interculturalism at McGill. I did film projects on on issues of anti-Semitism in the 1980s out of Hillel. I was the president of Hillel when I was a kid, and the director of Hillel, a guy named Jack Eisenberg and Mark Zarecki, they started a film cooperative, which I was very much engaged in. We were doing films at the National Film Board of Canada on issues of anti-Semitism in the place of the Jewish community in Quebec. And from that, I actually I went to Oxford and I did a doctorate degree dealing with issues of multiculturalism and integration and sort of the perception of belonging and otherness and how that affects social cultural policies. So that's sort of been my passion, my intellectual and political passion. And I really got into this. So I was active in human rights at Hillel. I was the chairperson of the Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry. And I went to the Soviet Union in 1984-85 and met with leading refuseniks, including the family of Natan Sharansky, who's now the chair of ISGAP. And I was very active in other human rights, the rights of the indigenous people of Canada, the First Nations. And also I was very active in the anti-apartheid movement. And I worked with the leadership of the African National Congress in the 1980s and 90s. And I came to really, I guess, my concern about anti-Semitism, contemporary anti-Semitism, started in the late 90s, 1990s and early 2000s. And I came across, I lived in Israel. I made Aliyah in the 90s. I lived there for 5 years. And during my time there, I was part of an Israeli-Palestinian reconciliation group of scholars. And once a month, we would have dinner at somebody's house in Jerusalem. And we were Palestinians and Israelis. And there was a man who was a professor of philosophy at Al-Quds University, a very nice, cultured Palestinian intellectual. And when we would meet, he would say the most bizarre things to me, and we would argue. He would say strange things about Jewish people, about women, about democracy, and many other issues, and we would argue. And around the fourth meeting, and he was a very nice guy, very cultured, very welcoming. And around the fourth meeting, I said, you know, instead of arguing with you, can you please recommend some books that inspire you? Give me some books. And he gave me the writings of Qutb and al-Banna, who are the intellectual founders of the Muslim Brotherhood, who I kind of heard of, but even though I studied political science at McGill and I did my doctorate at Oxford, I kind of heard about them, and I didn't really study them. And I started reading, and it kind of shocked me. And in the Muslim Brotherhood basically was started 100 years ago, and they basically combine an interpretation of Islam with kind of politics. Sort of they fuse politics and religion together. And they were heavily influenced by European anti-Semitism and even Nazism. And they kind of fused it with Islam. And for example, a key tenet of the Muslim Brotherhood is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is very much a European forged document that came out of Russia or France in the late 1800s, that forged document of the Protocols really laid the intellectual groundwork for rising anti-Semitism in Europe and removing Jews from society, and even led to the Holocaust, to the elimination of the Jewish people. And when I started reading how they really took the Protocols of the Elders of Zion as a fundamental core tenet of their ideology, I became very concerned. And at the time I was doing work on globalization and the impact of neoliberal structural adjustment and how the state was being kind of weakened or limited to allow free markets into society to develop them. And I really saw the Muslim Brotherhood as potentially filling the vacuum that was being left by the withdrawal of the state from society with structural adjustment and neoliberalism. And this was in the early 2000s that I started ISGAP, the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. And I started it with a small group of professors. And then Elie Wiesel agreed to become our first honorary president. And the ISGAP kind of emerged out of a meeting in 2003 that Elie Wiesel and Kofi Annan held in New York at the United Nations, which was the first conference at the United Nations that it ever held on anti-Semitism. And at the conference, Elie Wiesel and a few scholars were concerned about the beginning of the emergence of contemporary anti-Semitism. So that really marked the beginning of my engagement in ISGAP and its development.
Okay. Well, I have to, I'm going to break away from my next question. I'm going to ask you to follow up on what you've been saying. Do you see this connection between what you just described in this last 100 years of development, and you focused on, for lack of a better term, Middle Eastern and European base, to the spread that we see in contemporary, and how do you see that development? How did that happen?
So I don't want to sound too esoteric and academic, but I think that contemporary anti-Semitism sort of emerges out of kind of this issues of neoliberal structural adjustment, globalization, where the state, after the Second World War, the state played an important role in creating senses of citizenship, ensuring, at least in rhetorically or ideologically, ensuring that the state would usher in a period of economic, political, and social development. And the state was sort of the glue that held societies together. And with structural adjustment and neoliberalism, Reaganomics and Reagan and Thatcher in the 1980s, they really saw that economic development would usher in greater senses of freedom and democracy with economic development. And by taking the state out of the equation and allowing the free market to flourish, that this would create development and more democracy. And I and many scholars, I guess, saw the weakening of the state as a mistake, because the state in many societies provided basic necessities, basic education, healthcare, even subsidies for food. In advanced countries like in Europe and North America, the state provided social services, unemployment insurance, access to healthcare and education and the like. And this sort of model emerges after the Second World War, when the world got together and said that the economic catastrophe after the First World War, which led to economic and political crisis, which ushered in the era of the Second World War and led even to the Holocaust, the world got together after the Second World War and said we would never let this happen again, and ushered in an era of social democracy, of a strong states, of the models of international human rights and the like. And this sort of was being weakened, I think, by kind of the trickle-down free market economy. And I think societies and identities began to fragment and vacuums of power were created. So globalization and neoliberalism caused economic growth and development perhaps as never before, but it also causes marginalization. More and more segments of the population have been marginalized and have limited access to economic and political power and institutions. And identity politics becomes sort of the last terrain where people can sort of struggle. And reactionary social movements emerge. So the Muslim Brotherhood and reactionary social movements began to emerge in parts of the Middle East and parts of East Africa, where states were collapsing, where states were failing. And these reactionary social movements were providing, education through the mosque, basic forms of, of healthcare and rudimentary levels of education and subsidizing of food. And they were sort of replacing the state. And I think as people became more marginalized and more desperate, they're attracted to reactionary movements that give easy answers. And the Muslim Brotherhood was one. You see, I think the Iranian Revolution emerges around the same time with this sort of brand of reactionary Islam. And you see, as the states are failing and collapsing, this sort of rise of reactionary politics, which has at its core anti-Semitism, European genocidal anti-Semitism. And I think we begin to see the spread of this as the Syrian civil war, carried on for many years, and the refugees were moving into Turkey and then moving into Europe and threatening the status quo. You see also the rise of, I'd say, right-wing nationalist forms of anti-Semitism emerging too, as the economic and political crisis deepens. So I think economic and political marginalization, which is now being exacerbated in the lockdown economy of the pandemic, you see all of these contradictions sort of becoming more acute and more clear. And in a sense, I think the lockdown is just exacerbating and speeding up the contradictions that we were beginning to be concerned about. So you can see political Islam, right-wing nationalism, white supremacy, black supremacy, they're using at its core to attract people these old anti-Semitic ideologies and tropes. And it's very concerning. So we're trying, at our institute, we have scholars from different interdisciplinary backgrounds and expertise that are sort of mapping and decoding this emerging crisis.
Okay, I understand what you're saying, and I see the origin of this, having read Bernard Lewis and other people who have talked about the origins and how cultures historically were not in line, and the problems that developed with that. But I challenge you to explain to me how in today's reality of wealthy European, North American societies, where there's obviously great opportunity. And when you look at, let's take any industry like the sports industry, and this was recently in the news, sports personalities, entertainment personalities, easily, readily coming forward with anti-Semitic remarks and being shot down by people saying, no, because there's an obvious direct conflict. Jews have been very involved with the civil rights movement. I've read articles that equate Black Lives Matter with today's civil rights movement. It is defined as today's civil rights movement. And it seems to me that there's that problem of how do you reconcile those, where on the one hand, we supported as Jews the civil rights, the notion of that. And now we see a situation where we as Jews are divided. There are people that accept the idea that Black Lives Matter is today's version of the civil rights movement. Sports personalities are promoting that idea. There is at the same time, historically, this connection that Jews are the reason that there's a problem. They were the shop owners in the ghettos and all this other sort of thing. How do you respond to that? And again, I come to the question of a prescription. What are we supposed to do about the conflict?
Yeah, so it's a great question and an important issue. So I think the Black Lives Matter, I think our community needs to understand Black Lives Matter. And I think people, if they're on the left or on the right, they have very, I would argue, superficial understandings on the extremes of what Black Lives Matter is. So I think at one level, Black Lives Matter is sort of this organic reaction to police brutality and systemic racism, which if you live in the United States in particular, I live there for 18 years now. I'm speaking to you from Oxford in England, which it's a little calmer. But living in urban settings in the United States, you sense the level of segregation, of the sort of, I would say, underlining tensions, and if not violence, there's gun violence, there's levels of marginality. I lived in San Francisco for a year, 2 years ago, and in one area, in one zip code, you have some of the wealthiest people on the planet, and you have homeless families on the street and people who ought to be in hospitals wandering around the streets in urgent need of medication and homes and sanitation. It's really, it's a difficult place to see. So I think you have this reaction of police brutality that's organic, and I think the vast majority of African Americans, and I think people who care about decency and human rights in other communities, are kind of appalled at the brutality that we witnessed on the news, on the cable news. And I think this organic Black Lives Matter cuts across different churches, different segments of the African American community of society. There's the Prime Minister of Canada, the NHL, the Basketball Association, football players in Europe, heads of states across the world are lending their support to the legitimate rights of African Americans to live in their country as equal citizens, and I think they wish them support for their civil rights struggle, which is ongoing, unfortunately, in 2020. But then we also have to understand there's a small, I would argue it's a small segment. There's two groups. There's the Black Lives Matter Network, and there's the Black for Lives Association. There's two formal organizations. The network is a very, I think, extreme organization. It supports the defunding of police. It defends violence. It's virulently anti-Semitic. I think it's quite extreme in its pronouncements. And there's a strong connection between that group and the Congress, the radical Congress people, Ilhan Omar and her compatriots, and with the Nation of Islam. And I think this is a very problematic, small, well-organized segment of the Black Lives Matter, which I think people in the Jewish community, or people who care about democratic principles, ought to be unabashedly critical of. And in our research, I did I did a research project on Students for Justice in Palestine, which is very active on campuses in North America. And we showed how they were connected to the nation of, not only the Nation of Islam, but the Muslim Student Association, which is directly connected to the Muslim Brotherhood, which I was speaking about with you earlier, which is genocidal in its anti-Semitism. Yosef Kawadawi the head of the Muslim Brotherhood, consistently proclaims that all true believers are obligated to finish the work of Hitler. This is where they come from ideologically. They have many chapters. The Muslim Student Association and the Students for Justice in Palestine come out of this ideological framework, and they're on hundreds of campuses across the United States. And we did a major research projects on the Students for Justice in Palestine and their funding and their ideology. And it's on our website. And in my research, I kept finding these young, brilliant African-American graduate students and faculty members who were supporting the Students for Justice in Palestine. And if you remember at St. Louis, the police shooting in St. Louis 4 years ago, there was this whole program that came about called From Ferguson to Gaza. And this was created by the Nation of Islam, Louis Farrakhan. And Louis Farrakhan, we were studying since 2012, and the Nation of Islam was making a concerted effort to work with artists, musicians in the African-American community, and music and rap is a very integral part of African-American culture. And they were working with young journalists and also celebrities, sports stars and radio stars that we've seen in the last few weeks preach this hatred. And what the Nation of Islam teaches is that the Jewish people, this is core to their ideology, is that the Jewish people are Satan. And why are the Jewish people Satan? Not only have the Jewish people stolen the land of the original Jewish people, i.e. Black African Americans, but we've stolen their identity, we've stolen their religion. And Farrakhan, in the ideology, speaks about Jews as Satans because we are usurpers and stealers of identity, of the authentic Jewish identity. Us Jews are the imposters. And so when the radio host Cannon or the sports celebrities talk about the Jews as usurpers and this anti-Semitism that is emerging, we have to understand this is not the mistake of a few celebrities that they got their facts wrong. This is the pronouncements of people who have been indoctrinated into a religion and ideology which has these views as core to its religion and ideology. So these pronouncements come out of a small extreme element of the Black Lives Matter. And I think we as a community need to understand what is the Nation of Islam and what is their connection to Black Lives Matter, to the radical side of it. And I think this is a fringe of the Black Lives Matter, and it doesn't represent the legitimate claims of African Americans to be equal and to fight systemic racism and police brutality. It's horrific what young African Americans deal with on a day-to-day basis, particularly young African American men. And I think we in the community should build bridges and be supportive of the African American community in their quest for equal rights and justice. But at the same time, I think we have to educate ourselves to understand the Nation of Islam and the extreme elements of the Black Lives Matter. And I think, without this sort of liberal paternalistic hypocrisy, we should fight anti-Semitism wherever it is, if it's from the white nationalists and extremists, which are now also emerging in the United States, or from this sort of radical element in the African-American community and in Black Lives Matter. So I think we need to really understand the nuances and the complexities of this social movement, support the legitimate aspirations of all, of citizens to be equal, but to really understand the anti-Semitism and its dangers and speak out against it unequivocally.
I'm going to follow up on that with an easy question. I'll try and phrase it clearly. The criticism of that anti-Semitism that is a small component of this movement of civil rights for Blacks, the Black Lives Matter organization. The moment somebody makes that criticism of that element that is within it, as you just did, you're canceled, as the expression goes. You've got a problem. You're going to be called all kinds of names, and I'm sure it's you're familiar with that. So what's the prescription for that? How do you handle that? How do you deal with the idea that the moment you say there's something unhealthy going on here, the very fact that you're pointing it out lends you to being criticized? What do you do?
So I think we have to have thick skins, and that's the first thing. And I think, in a sense, we have to ask ourselves, what are we fighting for? What do we believe in? What are we struggling for? And if, whether the people listening in, I'm sure, whether we support the Republicans or the Conservative Party in Canada, or the NDP or the Liberals in Canada and the Democrats in the United States, I'm sure everybody listening in believes in democracy and believes that every group, regardless of race, religion, income, ethnicity, language, we should all be equal on gender. We should all be equal under law, no matter what the differences are. That all citizens need to be equal. And I think that if we deal with basic democratic principles, it's clear we should support people fighting for equal treatment and justice under one law. And I think we have to criticize people who want to destroy democracy or are scapegoating against anybody, Jews or any other group. And if we're going to be called names, so be it. One of the things I was speaking to a friend before we came on, who's a rabbi, and it's Shabbat. It's the Shabbat Gadol. It's the Shabbat before Rosh Hashanah, and it's a very important Shabbat. And my friend, who's a rabbi, was saying, unlike the Gregorian New Year, the Gentile New Year, where people make resolutions, this year I'll stop smoking, or I'll drink less, or I'll be more this or less that. We make these resolutions. And I think in Judaism, Shabbat Gadol is sort of, we think and reflect on how we could understand the wisdom and of our tradition, and the amazing knowledge and wisdom that we have been handed down after generations of rabbinical analysis of text and ideas and from Sinai, that we have this amazing gift of knowledge and wisdom. And Shabbat Gadol means that we have to sort of refocus our energies to try to understand our heritage at a deeper, more sophisticated level. That's what we as Jews are supposed to do. And I think in our wisdom and in our knowledge that we have as a people, that we have all sorts of tools to deal with these issues of anti-Semitism, or being labeled, or being targeted, if you will, or even insulted. And I think, in a sense, these groups are always trying to define us. And what's incredible is that, 2 generations ago, the Jewish people were exterminated because we weren't white. Now people are saying we're white and privileged, and we're not now being called white and privileged because, sorry for the catastrophe of 2 generations ago. We're sorry. Now you're welcome to the club as equals. No, we're being targeted by not only the Nation of Islam and the extremists of Black Lives Matter, but also by intellectuals in the finest universities in Canada and the United States and of Europe. And we are being labeled as white privileged usurpers in the finest institutions, at Concordia to Oxford is where we both sit. And we've always been defined by the left, by the right, by the religious, by the secular. And I think as a people, it's not enough to say that the radical elements of Black Lives Matter is anti-Semitic, or white nationalists are anti-Semitic, or the Nation of Islam is anti-Semitic, or the Muslim Brotherhood is anti-Semitic. I think we as a people need to really understand who we are and to be proud of who we are. And we're not white, we are white, we're not good for the left, we're bad for the right. We have all these labels put on us. And I think, through learning and studying who we are, I think there's a lot of wisdom, and all the answers are within our heritage to respond to these moments. And I think we have to spend time and energy investing in what it is to be Jewish. And I think once we know who we are, and we're not only proud of who we are, but we are confident who we are, we have a deep knowledge of who we are, all these labels that people are putting on us should, like water off a duck's back. We should, be proud and know who we are, and I think respond to the situation and even the crisis that we're in as a strong people rooted in knowledge and wisdom. And I think that will go a long way to, as a tool or as a remedy to the challenges we face.
Good. I'll take that one step further into the academic environment, the academic world. I know that there are many programs that have been set up to help students, Jewish students, deal with when they're confronted by anti-Semitic professors or fellow students, administrators, and so on. I have two related questions. One is you've kind of answered already, which is how should students deal with that, whether they want to join or do an educational program to learn how to do that, and you might mention something about it. Plus what you've already said, which is your own personal strength of identity is your best defense and ability to cope with whatever problems come your way, whether they're anti-Semitic or something else. But underneath all that, what bothers me more than anything else is I cannot find an answer to how all this penetrated the academic environment. There are organizations that are so large. We're talking about thousands of people that are working or students that are there, and somehow or other over a very short period of time, what was never allowed, it just wasn't, we didn't do this. An organization would never get a permit to put up a poster that would be, by today's standards, it's considered nothing. And how did that happen? How did that get to the point where institutions that were so celebrated as places of learning, places of information, non-judgmentalism of individual choice to live and be a certain way in so many different identity ways, how did we lose this in terms of rampant anti-Semitism on campus? In some places, especially ones that you can cite, how did that happen and what do we do about that?
So it's a very important question, and there's not an easy response. I think there's a complex response, but I'll say briefly. I think it happened on two tracks. I think one, we actually did a research project that led to a federal investigation. We did a Follow the Money project. It's a long story, but we had a research center at Yale University from 2006 to 2011. And we were closed, even though we were a financially sufficient organization. We had projects and research fellows and graduate studies program. It was a vibrant, successful entity, and it was closed down with no explanation, which is odd. It's a long story. But by chance, I found out that the vice president of Yale University, who played a key role in closing down our center, worked for a pharmaceutical company that was owned by a Saudi person connected to terror activities, terror financing, and literally to terror funding. This Saudi was connected to a network that was basically funding American universities and giving Muslim Brotherhood-backed funding to universities. We found $3 billion in unreported funding by 10 American universities. To make a long story short, our research project helped to launch a federal investigation into illegal funding of American universities. It's ongoing, and I know they've now found up to $9 billion in unreported money from the Muslim Brotherhood, from Qatar, from Saudis. And what they were doing was funding universities, funding chairs of departments, funding research centers, which would peddle not necessarily overt classical forms of anti-Semitism, but anti-Israeli rhetoric, education, and scholarship. And they've been doing this for about 30 odd years. And I think that this has had a deep effect on the education that we are receiving at the finest universities in Canada, in the United States, and certainly throughout Europe. I mentioned Yosef Kaudawi earlier, the head of the Muslim Brotherhood, who says that all true believers need to complete the work of Hitler. Yosef Kaudawi was instrumental in starting Islamic studies at no other place than where I am now at Oxford University. So how the establishment, the English establishment, the American establishment, the French establishment, the Italian establishment could take the money from people that have this ideology which fuses Islam with European anti-Semitism and Nazism. So the Muslim Brotherhood was connected to Nazism. So this funding has had an impact on our education. And also, I guess, this sort of philosophical moment of postmodernity, of decolonization, the Edward Saids and Michel Foucaults of the world, who also supported, for example, Said and Foucault supported the Islamic revolution in Iran as being akin to the French Revolution and Enlightenment. And this is sort of the intellectual giants of our time. And they had a very anti-Israeli perspective, anti-Zionist perspective. Now, for many years, even the Jewish community in the West, we took this education. I was a product of this education, the kind of anti-racist, anti-colonial, postmodern education. That was what I learned and became fluent in. And in that discourse, there was this deep-seated criticism of Israel, that Israel was an apartheid, racist, colonial entity. And Jewish intellectuals and the Jewish communities were saying, okay, they're critical of Israel, but we're okay here. And what we have seen is that this sort of the attack of political Islam, and this what we call it the Red-Green Alliance, the extreme left and the extreme Islamists. Not all Muslims in the world are Islamists. That's very important to understand. I think the vast majority of Muslims globally
It's 2 hours.
Don't adhere to political Islam. So we have sort of the Red-Green Alliance where people are very critical of Israel. But if Israel is an apartheid, colonial, pink-washing entity, then Jewish communities who have a strong affinity to that entity are problematic. Jewish students going to universities in this sort of postmodern, multicultural, liberal space, if they go to Hillels or Chabad houses, which has a strong affinity to this racist, apartheid, colonial entity, then the Jewish students on campus become a problem. Jewish communities are a problem. So when people in France or in Germany or in Britain go to shul on Shabbat, they are not only targeted by radical Muslims and citizens in their midst, but they're also, targeted in this sort of politically correct moment among the intellectual elites or the reading classes as well. So I think the demonization of Jewish peoplehood is very much a part of the lexicon, the intellectual lexicon, what we're learning in universities. The media of record, the New York Times, the Guardian, Le Monde, they also criticize Israel. And I think this has led to anti-Semitism creeping into certainly Europe in the last 20 years. They've dealt with in France and England significant forms of anti-Semitism. And I think this wave has entered North America also later, but I'd say in the last 10 or 15 years, it's certainly entered into our universities. And studies show that young Jewish people in North America in universities are experiencing anti-Semitism at a much higher rate than older Jewish people. And they're experiencing anti-Semitism at higher rates than women experience sexism, and people, African Americans or Black people in North America experience racism. So these universities has become a hostile environment, and that's the space where our future leaders are coming out of. And we can see in places like Parliament and in Congress that the graduates of these universities with this education are now preaching what they've learned in school, and it's becoming part of the larger society. So it's a great challenge.
Well, to follow up on that, so this normalization, because that's what you're describing here. Is there no way to control it? Is there no way other than to point it out and maybe mitigate some of the development that might be there, and saying, look out for that, this is what's going on? I'll follow it up more directly with what happened at Yale. In other words, when you were forced to step away, What were the consequences? Were you able to develop any public relations benefit from the, by pointing the finger at what was done to you?
So we worked on this project, the Follow the Money project, for 7 years. And I presented last summer in July of 2019. I presented at the Department of Justice at a meeting where the Attorney General and the Assistant Attorney General were present, the Secretary of Education, the head of the FBI, the Secretary of State, the head of Homeland Security. It was sort of the head of the FBI were there, and the top civil servants from every department. And I was part of a one-day summit on these issues. And we presented our findings there. And this led, there was an announcement in November of 2019 that an investigation was being launched into illegal funding of American universities. And I think that was the first time in the sort of 7-year struggle that my colleagues and I thought, like, okay, now we've done something. And I believe that these issues are being taken very seriously in the United States, and there's a serious investigation. And I think that universities are clearly going to be found out of taking funding illegally and not reporting it to the IRS or to the Department of Education, as they have to under the law. And then we're now working on a project where we will show, we believe we can show, that departments and universities that took money, for example, Texas A&M took nearly $1 billion from the Qatari Foundation, which is the Muslim Brotherhood. Georgetown University, Yale, Harvard, Cornell, they're all have been taking funds. But we can now show, we're using artificial intelligence. There's a colleague, Joel Finkelstein at Princeton, that have developed mechanisms where they can evaluate people who've been hired, the certain words in books and in curriculum, and how it's changed over years. And we could demonstrate a correlation between funding and the changing discourse of curriculum and education in certain departments that were funded by the Muslim Brotherhood. So if we show this, I think the universities will be, well, we can demonstrate that universities have been instrumental in proliferating anti-Semitism, and perhaps they could even be legally responsible for causing hatred in society. But we can definitely make the link, and I think that's important. On the positive side, I think some of the moderate Sunni countries now who are beginning to develop a rapprochement with Israel, it's very important. There was the Saudi Arabians did an internal security assessment about 3 years ago, and they realized that they'll probably only have stability for about 5 years. That was their assessment. And they're being threatened not only by Iran, but also by the Muslim Brotherhood internally. And I think that this is why there's such a shift now with the United Arab Emirates and now Bahrain, and the Saudis are certainly a part of this process, the Jordanians, the Egyptians. So I think at some level in the Middle East that people are beginning to realize that the Muslim Brotherhood and political Islam is a threat not only to Israel and the Jewish people, but stability in the Middle East and beyond. So maybe this will start to reverberate internationally, I hope. But right now, in Western countries, the Muslim Brotherhood are the go-to people for policy and community development in Europe and North America. So it's still difficult, but maybe there's more awareness now through these changes.
Okay, I have another question. I'm going to ask anybody in our audience that in the chat section, if you have a question for Charles Asher Small, you're welcome to put one in, and I'll get to those in a moment. But I'll end my questioning maybe by asking what your research shows about the internet in general, social media sites in particular, the good, the bad, the ugly, about what that is, because there's no question that this has been probably since the mid-90s a catalyst to everything that's going on. Everybody has a voice, the good news and the bad news, everybody has a voice. So what is your research, or is there a specialized area of research into what's happening with social media in particular, and even beyond that, just using websites that are dedicated to proliferation of this anti-Semitism, or communicating and persuading people and so on. What do you know about that?
So it's not my area of expertise, but it's certainly a very important area, and there's more research being done on the impact of social media on anti-Semitism, racism, bullying. It's a very important issue. My colleague who I mentioned earlier, Joel Finkelstein, is part of a group that's connected to ISGAP, that they're doing innovative work with artificial intelligence, monitoring social media and the evolving discourse in the US. And they're measuring the radicalization of the extremists in the United States, the sort of the white nationalists, and also African-American nationalists and Antifa, the extreme left. And they're watching how discourse is becoming more radical, and the discourse is now not just radical, but it's encouraging the development of militias, which is being monitored, and militias are growing at a rapid rate. And also the discourse is shifting from rhetoric to a call for action. So they're very concerned about sort of the rapid growth of extremists and the rapidly changing discourse of the extremists. So, and this is a group that predicted the attack in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life synagogue. And they were calling the FBI about a month before, saying that, you know, in sort of this area of the United States, they're very concerned that an attack would happen. So, and they're just watching things kind of spiral on social media. So it's, the United States is going through a very difficult time, and the fragmentation of society and I guess the increased rhetoric of the extremists is concerning. And I think that they're doing amazing work kind of documenting this, but it's worrying.
Do you know of any effort to, I don't know how to phrase this well, but to infiltrate, socially speaking? In other words, you have a very toxic social media site that's putting out information. It seems to me the reverse has been done, where these groups have sent people to put in information, to confuse, to mislead. Do you have any research into the reverse? In other words, something very positive about something that would really mess up their agenda in terms of understanding what's going on. Is any of that sort of stuff going on?
Yeah, I think that stuff is going on. It's not my area of expertise at all, and I'm not being humble at all. It's, but from the periphery, I'm aware that I think there's a bit of a revolution happening, a technological revolution, where people are creating, through artificial intelligence and cybersecurity, all sorts of ways to monitor extremism and to engage in promoting and countering different types of discourse. And they're using technology at a level that's, I don't know, a century ahead of my capacity to even begin to understand. So I think there's a lot of that in the cyber world happening and affecting us, you know, in our discourse through social media. I think it's definitely a part of the sort of complexities of how we receive information.
The new frontier, for sure.
Yeah.
I'm going to go to the questions that that our audience has sent in, and I'll just read it straight out. A question from Norm Spatz says, despite their support for Israel, am I right to be wary of the American evangelical movement?
It's a good question. So I know many people in the Jewish community and in Israel work with members of the evangelical community. And I think some of those relations have actually been impactful in a positive way. And that's good. I think as a scholar and as an intellectual, where I'm not engaged in politics as such, I guess as a scholar, I find it difficult to work with people engaged in a religious understanding that cannot accept the Jewish people for who we are. And, you know, that we need to be saved. I find that troubling. And, you know, on the other note, I was trained in Jewish ethics and in the work of Emmanuel Levinas. And I think the beauty and the wisdom within Judaism is that we believe that we're all created in the image of God, that we all have a piece of godliness or truth within us. Or we're not born in sin, and we're born in the image of God. And I think in Judaism, we have to recognize the other. Emmanuel Levinas, using Jewish thought and Pirkei Avot and Jewish ethics, always argued beautifully that we need to see our face, when we see our face in the face of the other, when we recognize our face in the face of the other, that's the instant we become human. So we need the other to be human. And that is not what the evangelicals believe, that, you know, in order to be connected to God or saved, you have to change and you have to accept the notion of the Christian Messiah. So there's sort of a criteria, there's hoops you have to jump through to become human or to become connected to God. And I think that's very dangerous. And I think you see this in political Islam as well. So I think, you know, accepting people for who they are, that we're all created in the image of God, is a profound idea that's central to Judaism. And I think working with movements that don't believe that, you know, that believe that Jews are basically blinded by evil is a problem. But I understand for politics, there's benefits to working with all sorts of people, but I find it problematic.
My comment to that, just to share, going back 25, 30 years ago, when I first came across Bernard Lewis, and I read several of his books, and I kept putting it down saying, I can't believe this. Like I didn't understand the origin of the hatred, and the others books, I'm trying to remember the author now, Constantine's Sword.
Yeah, Campbell, Joseph Campbell.
Carroll.
Yeah, Joseph Carroll, yeah.
Yes, from Boston. And the whole Catholic and of course there's the religious source to it, in that we started all this. I think we were one of the starters of it, this belief, and it was taken over and taken in different directions. And because we didn't go along with it, there is that ancient hatred, whatever, for lack of a better word. But we have today, I think it's more on a social level more than anything else. You brought up at the very beginning this discussion about the economic problems and so on that seem to precipitate this anger and frustration, and somehow or other it finds its way aimed at people who are doing better, what have you. Anyway, that's just my 2 cents worth on that. I have a note on the side that Isabella Hassan wants to ask a question herself. So Billy, if you can turn that audio on.
Hi, Charles. The question is over here from Isabella.
Hello.
Hi.
So my question is, what do you think of the IRA definition of anti-Semitism? As a student, I know we're encouraged to get it adopted by our student government, and I know it's been adopted by like world governments. Do you think it's effective? And if so, why is there so much backlash around it? And it's very controversial still.
Right. That's a great question. So yeah, I support the definition, the IRA definition. And in fact, our research center and some of my colleagues played a role in defining contemporary anti-Semitism, which is kind of connected and adopted in part by the IRA definition. I worked on an article with Professor Ed Kaplan, and we interviewed 10,000 people in Europe, and this was in 2006. And we measured levels of classical forms of anti-Semitism and what we called Israel bashing, extreme ideas of Israel, that Israel's an apartheid state, or the Israelis intentionally kill Palestinian kids, things like this. So in our analysis, we defined who was an anti-Semite and who was an Israel basher. And even though the levels of anti-Semitism and Israel bashing were quite low in the 10 European countries that we analyzed, the correlation between people who hate Israel and who are classically anti-Semitic is very high. So the correlation is strong. So I think the IRA definition does something very important, where it shows that if Jewish individuals are being blamed for Israeli policy, or if people call Israel an apartheid Nazi state, this is a problem. It violates the IRA definition. So I think it's wonderful. More and more countries are accepting it. Spain just accepted it. The United Nations just appointed an ambassador that is promoting the definition, the IRA definition. Canada, Erwin Kotler in Canada are at the forefront of adopting it. It's very important. Just on a personal level, in 2011, when they closed our center down at Yale because we were Zionist, fascist, apartheid supporters in part, there was really no recourse. At Oxford a year ago, 9 of my colleagues from our research center came to a conference at Oxford. There's about 125 professors from all over the world. There was a conference on racism and nationalism, and we had 2 panels of leading professors from Israel, Europe, and North America presenting on racism and anti-Semitism, and we were banned. Professors stood up and said that, and I was with African-American colleagues from historically Black colleges. We were, an international multicultural group. They stood up and said that the ISGAP is a fascist, apartheid, racist research center, and my colleagues and I were promoting Zionism and racism in academia, and we had 3 African-American colleagues, and we were blackwashing Zionism, and we were banned from the conference. And it was a traumatic. It sounds, funny at one level, and but at some level it was quite traumatic for my colleagues and I. Actually, one woman in particular was really traumatized from it. But Oxford has as its guideline the IRA definition. It's not the law of the university, but it's a guideline for issues of discrimination and anti-Semitism at Oxford. And people were actually trying to kick me out of Oxford because I'm a fellow here, a scholar here, and they were trying to get rid of me because I'm a fascist, apartheid colonialist. And I spoke to professors here who are high up at the university in the administration, and my colleagues explained what happened. We actually submitted an affidavit to Alan Dershowitz, who's on our board, and he wrote a letter to the university. And I said my piece, and I knew that nothing was going to happen to me because it was such a clear, disgusting exhibition of blatant anti-Semitism based on the IRA definition, which is now a guideline at the university. So I knew everything was going to be okay, and it was. So the university took a stand. They had some sort of discussions, and they were consulting with the professors from Oxford who were at the conference, and there was a strong push to get me out, and the university knew about it. They looked into it for a week, and a week later, the second most important person at Oxford University called me, and he told me that I'm welcomed here, and I'm always welcome here. I'm a graduate of Oxford, and he said, this is your university, you're always welcome here. And I am certain, if it was not for the IRA definition, I would not be speaking to you tonight from Oxford. So I think it's very important. I think the backlash that you pointed out is real. And I think the people who want to demonize and delegitimize Israel and the rights that Jewish people have to self-determination in that part of the world, they're pushing back because they know that this is it's a serious impediment to their expression of delegitimizing the Jewish people. So I think it's very important. And it's not the answer, but I think it's part of a toolkit to fight back against anti-Semitism, and I think it's an important part of the toolkit that people are developing to fight back. So it's a good question, and I hope you'll promote it in your school.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we can wind this up. I'll leave the final remarks to Charles as far as advice, and at the same time, any parting remarks that you'd like to leave us with. But before you do, I'm going to thank you. I found this experience very interesting, very uplifting. I learned a great deal from our conversation. I'm sure everybody watching did as well. And the final word goes to you.
Thanks. So, I'm honored. It's an honor to be here with you, and thank you. And to close, I remember the words of Elie Wiesel, who was our first honorary president of ISGAP, and who was an amazing scholar and professor, and I guess moral witness to the Holocaust and to issues of human rights throughout his life. And I remember in Ottawa, it was in 2003, he said that we're living through a time of great urgency. And he was never so worried about the reemergence of anti-Semitism in 2003 as he was since the end of the Second World War and the Holocaust. And he said, we're living in a time of great urgency. And then he stopped and he corrected himself and he said, no, this is not a time of great urgency. It's a time of an emergency. And in 2003, from 2003 to now, we know that things have gotten more serious and I think more alarming to us. And it's more pervasive and it's more clear to everybody that there's a problem. So I think once we acknowledge the problem, it's good. And I think the community is beginning or has began to deal with it in a serious way. And we know that this is a time, as Elie Wiesel said, of an emergency. And I think in a time of an emergency, it's all hands on deck. And I think as a community, we have to come together. A fragmented, divided community is catastrophic politically, and I think even at a deeper level. And I think we have to come together across the political divides that our societies are dealing with now, from the left and the right, the Democrats, the Republicans, the Trumps, the Bidens. These divisions are in many societies, and it's a time of fragmentation. And I think we have to come together, and we don't have to agree on everything, but I think we have to come together as a community and fight for the rights of the Jewish people, to fight against anti-Semitism in institutions like education and in other institutions. I think we have to reach out, especially to younger Jewish people, because they're basically on the front lines. There is a difference between how younger Jewish people are experiencing anti-Semitism to older Jewish people. So I think coming together is very important. And I think, coming together and not just reacting to the way anti-Semites are defining us and, pointing out the hypocrisy and the contradictions in their argument as we must. But I think also coming together as a community and re-educating and relearning the wisdom that we have, which is incredible, and to learn from the wisdom of our heritage and to put it into action and to come together as a community, as Jewish people. And I think Jewish identity and Jewish wisdom is really, it transcends who's left and who's right and who's white and who's black. It's much more profound than these superficial distinctions that are dividing us. And I think that is the message. And I think to learn the wisdom of the rabbis, to learn with Rabbi Bright, to learn with other rabbis in the community, and to instill within us not just a superficial pride/nationalism, but a pride rooted in the wisdom that we have. And I think that will carry us forward. And I also think it's time for a sort of a neo-Zionist movement within our community. And I think we should unashamedly
Thank you, Charles.
And really thank you for moderating and asking the questions, and it's an honor to be with the shul tonight and with the community.
My pleasure. Shana Tova.
Shana Tova. Happy, healthy year to you and to the whole congregation.
Thank you.
Thank you.